Hello, welcome to this series of observations. This is observation number 5, and it's called Life Responds to the Conditions that We Create. Many times we have the illusion of control. I'm going to tell you a story. For many years, my father's ranch followed what seemed to be a perfectly logical strategy. Every dry season, the pastures were burnt. The ranch was around 1,500 hectares or 3,200 acres in the humid tropics of Mexico. Rainfall was abundant, and with the rain came vigorous grass regrowth. But grass was never the only thing that grew. Shrubs, woody plants, and countless species we simply called weeds appeared with it. So the solution seemed obvious. Take them out, burn them. Each year, the fire swept across the hillsides, removing all vegetation and leaving behind black fertile soil. A few weeks later, with the first rains, fresh green shoots emerged everywhere, and from a distance it looked like success. The ranch looked clean, everybody else was doing it, but the land started to answer. Just the beginning. Little by little, grass production declined. Daily weights gain dropped. Steep hillsides began to lose soil to erosion. At first, this looked like separate problems: less grass, less daily gain, more erosion. And we never imagined they were all parts of the same conversation. Eventually, my father realized that burning every year was damaging the ranch. So he stopped. The fire disappeared, the shrubs returned, and they came back faster than expected, filling spaces where the that would give the soil enough time to recover. But it didn't. The decline continued. The shrubs continued. Then a modern solution. An airplane was hired to spray herbicide over nearly the entire ranch. In the first year, results were extraordinary. The brush disappeared. Sunlight now could reach the grasses back. Everyone believed the problem had finally been solved. Just keep on spraying herbicide. But even though the second year required no spraying, the grass was strong. But the third year, the shrubs were back. And another application produced only modest results. A third produced even less, and people began saying what people often say when yesterday's solutions stops working. The herbicide is not as good as it used to be. Perhaps, or perhaps something had changed, something else. Eventually, herbicides gave way to machinery. Large tractors equipped with heavy-duty batwing mowers replaced both fire and chemicals. Again, the pastures looked better. Again, the unwanted plants were removed. Again, only for a while. No matter which tool we used, the same story repeated itself. We had used fire, herbicide, machinery. Each one changed what we could see. None changed what was making that possible: the invasion. So for years, we believed we were fighting weeds, and we weren't. We were fighting a response. You see, the cattle repeatedly grazed their favorite grasses before they had recovered. And these grasses became weaker. And the plants that the cattle avoided remained untouched. They kept their leaves, captured more sunlight, expanded deeper roots occupied the empty spaces left behind. So, the more we protected the plants we disliked, the more opportunities we unknowingly created for them. The ranch wasn't disobeying us, nature wasn't working against us. Life was simply responding to the conditions we had created. And that realization took me years to fully understand. You see, life does not respond to how hard we work. It does not respond to how much money we invest. It does not respond to the size of the machinery or the sophistication of our technology. Life responds to the conditions that actually exist. Reality. You can remove a plant, but if the conditions that allowed it to grow remain unchanged, something else will simply take its place. Most of us respond by looking for a stronger tool, a bigger machine, a better chemical, a more powerful solution. But perhaps we are asking the wrong question. Perhaps the real question isn't how do I eliminate these problems? Perhaps it is what conditions am I creating that make this problem possible? Because once that question changes, everything else begins to change with it. When we walked those pastures, the shrubs demanded our attention. They stood taller than the grass shading them. They occupied space. They were easy to measure, easy to blame, and because they were visible, they became the center of every decision. That is one of the greatest traps in observation. What we can see is not always where the story began. The shrubs appear above the soil. Their advantage began long before that. Every time a desirable grass was grazed before it had fully recovered, it lost a little more strength. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to change the landscape overnight. Just a little less leaf, a little less energy, a little less root. Meanwhile, the plants the cattle avoided continued growing uninterrupted. They captured more sunlight, stored more energy, expanded deeper roots. Year after year, one group of plants slowly lost opportunity while the other quietly accumulated them. Nothing dramatic happened on any particular day. The difference was built one grazing event at a time. And eventually, the landscape changed enough for everyone to notice, and we called it a weed problem. But by that time, when they were visible, the story had already been unfolding for years. And that lesson reaches far beyond a pasture. You see, a cow rarely loses body condition in a single day. A business rarely runs out of cash because of one bad decision. A marriage seldom fails because of one difficult conversation. The visible moment is often the final chapter of a story that began much earlier. And yet, we instinctively attack what we can see. We pull the weed out, treat the symptom, patch the crack, silence the warning light. Because visible problems create a powerful illusion that solving what is visible means solving what is real, but it often doesn't. Years ago, when something went wrong, my first question was always, what's causing this? It seems like a reasonable question. I searched for a deficiency, a disease, a pest, an invasive plant, something I could identify and fix. Eventually, I realized there was a better question. a question that completely changed the way I observe living systems. Instead of asking, what is causing this? I began asking, what had to happen for this to eventually become possible? At first, the difference seems small, but it isn't. The first question searches for an enemy. The second searches for a sequence. The first focuses on today's symptom. The second uncovers yesterday's conditions. And that single change redirects your attention from the surface to the process. The weeds were never simply invading the ranch. Their seeds had likely been there for years, and they weren't waiting for permission, they were waiting for opportunity. And as the grasses weakened, opportunity appeared. Life accepted the invitation. That realization changed something much deeper than my grazing management. I began to see that every living system is constantly responding to opportunities. And not only ranches, everything. You see, a healthy system and a struggling one may experience the same drought, the same market, the same storm, the same challenge. Yet, they often respond very differently. Why? Because they arrive at that moment carrying different histories, different capacities, different conditions. The event may be identical, but the response rarely is. That is why two ranchers can receive exactly the same rainfall and harvest completely different futures. The rain isn't the whole story, neither is the drought. The story began long before either one arrived. From that day forward, I stopped seeing weeds as enemies. I began seeing them as information. They were telling me something about the land. Removing them without understanding their message was like disconnecting the warning light on a truck's dashboard. The light disappears, but the problem doesn't. That insight changed the way I approach every challenge afterward. Whenever something caught my attention, I became less interested in removing it and more interested in understanding why life had created it in the first place. Because perhaps what we're trying so hard to eliminate isn't the problem at all. Perhaps the problem is the answer. And if that's true, then the next question becomes even more important. If the visible problem isn't the real problem, how can we make better decisions? For many years, whenever a problem appeared on a ranch, the next step seemed obvious. We asked, what should we do? It sounds like a practical question, and sometimes it is. Animals still need to be fed, bills still have to be paid, pastures still have to be managed. Doing nothing rarely is an option, but over time, I discovered something surprising. By the time we ask, what should we do? We usually have already made the most important decision. Not with our hands, with our interpretation. Because we choose a solution. If we believe weeds are the problem, we search for ways to kill weeds or shrubs. If we believe the problem is a nutrient deficiency, we look for a fertilizer. If we believe the problem is drought, we look for irrigation. Our solutions follow our explanations. And that means the quality of our decisions depend on something much deeper than experience or intelligence. It depends on the quality of our questions. One sentence can completely change the future. Consider these two questions. How do I eliminate the traps? Or why have those traps gained the advantage? The pasture hasn't changed, the traps haven't changed, only the question has changed. Yet, the second question immediately opens an entirely different world. Now we begin asking about grazing pressure, recovery time, root reserves, competition, ground cover, water infiltration, the history of the pasture, even our own management, because the pasture and the soil have memory. A better question doesn't simply produce a better answer. It reveals possibilities that were invisible before. That is why I have learned to be suspicious of answers that arrive too quickly, good and bad. Sometimes fast answers simply mean we ask a shallow question. Nature has taught me that living systems are rarely simple, not complicated, but interconnected. A single visible result may be connected to dozens of relationships we cannot yet see. And that realization also changed the way I think about mistakes. When an experiment fails, our first instinct is often to defend the decision or to blame something outside ourselves. It can be the weather, the market, genetics, the economy, and sometimes those explanations are completely valid. We cannot control rainfall, we cannot control markets, we cannot control every single variable. But even when we cannot control the event, we still participate in the conditions under which the system must respond. Two ranches can receive exactly the same drought. One survives, the other struggles. The drought is shared, the response is not. The difference was being created long before the clouds disappeared. And that realization removed something I didn't even know I was carrying: the need to find someone or something to blame. Observation is not about assigning blame. It is about discovering capacity, opportunities. What has this system lost? What can I still do? What is beginning to recover? What conditions will allow that capacity to grow again? Those questions produce completely different decisions. They also change the way we think about success. Because for years, I judged decisions by one simple measure. Did they work? Now I ask a different question. Will they continue working? And those are not the same thing. A chemical can produce immediate results. So can overgrazing, so can debt, so can pushing cattle harder than they should be pushed. Many decisions create a short-term improvement. Far fewer create a lasting one. And that distinction has become one of the most important filters in my life. Whenever I make a decision today, I ask myself, does this solve today's problem? Or does it increase tomorrow's capacity? And sometimes the answer is both. Sometimes it isn't. But simply asking that question changes the decision before it's made. Because every decision does more than solve a problem. Every decision creates the conditions for the next decision. And once you begin seeing that, you can never manage a ranch, a business, or even your own life the same way again. Because sooner or later, every observer arrives at the same realization. Life is not waiting for our intentions. It is responding to the opportunities we leave behind. If decisions matter so much, what is life actually responding to? Life responds to reality, opportunities, capacities, not intentions. You see, a seed can lie hidden in the soil for years. You can walk over it hundreds of times without knowing they are there. They survive heat, cold, heavy rain, long droughts. It doesn't own a calendar. It doesn't know your plans. It doesn't care what you hope will happen. It simply waits. Then, one day, conditions are created. Moisture arrives, temperature is right, sunlight reaches the soil, gases are correct, suddenly it germinates. Most people will say the seed came to life that day. It didn't. The life was already there. What changed was the opportunity. That simple observation changed the way I began looking at every single living system. For years, I believed that good management meant producing results. And today, I see it differently. Good management creates opportunity. A fence doesn't make grass grow. It changes where animals graze. Rest doesn't make a plant stronger. It creates the opportunity for recovery. Ground cover does not produce rain, but it changes what happens when rain finally arrives. Almost everything we do as managers works this way. We rarely produce life directly, but we influence the conditions under which life can respond. And it may sound like a small difference, but it isn't. It changes our role completely. Life is constantly responding to opportunities. When light reaches the soil, something will grow. Where space opens, something will occupy it. When energy becomes available, some organism will use it. Nature wastes very little. This is why empty spaces rarely stay empty for long. And the question is never whether something will respond. The question is, what have we made possible? That realization also changed the way I think about potential. Sometimes we look at a pasture and conclude, this land just isn't very productive. Perhaps, but perhaps we are only seeing the limits of today's conditions. Potential and current performance are not the same thing. I have walked ranches that appeared exhausted, thin grass, bare soil, little biological activity. Most people assumed they had reached the land's limit. But years later, after changing the conditions, those same ranches looked completely different. Not because we installed new life, but because we removed some of the barriers that had been preventing life from expressing what was already possible. The capacity had been there all along. The opportunity had not. That has made me much more careful about judging people as well. Sometimes we decide too quickly that someone lacks ability, or discipline, or talent, but perhaps they have simply never experienced the conditions that will allow those qualities to emerge. And the same is true in families, in businesses, in education, in leadership. We often confuse unrealized potential with absent potential, and they are not the same. Of course, creating opportunities does not mean controlling outcomes. That is another illusion. Two pastures managed almost identically can still respond differently because no two living systems are exactly alike. Hidden seeds, different soil biology, different stories, different weather patterns, different relationships. Life always contains variables we cannot fully predict. That is precisely why observation remains essential. Our responsibility is not to force the response. Our responsibility is to notice the response, to learn from it, to adjust, to create better conditions again. You see, management is no longer a series of commands, but becomes a continuous conversation. We participate, life answers. We observe, then we participate again, and that cycle never ends. Perhaps that is the greatest difference between manufacturing and working with living systems. A machine does exactly what it is designed to do. A living system does something far more remarkable. It keeps responding. It builds capacity every day to every condition, whether we recognize those conditions or not, which leads to another question. If life is constantly responding and we cannot control every response, what then is the true responsibility of the observer? One of the greatest lessons nature has ever taught me is this. Every important change begins long before it becomes obvious. A healthier pasture doesn't suddenly appear one morning. A stronger herd isn't created overnight. A better business doesn't transform in a single season. Long before the results become visible, something has already begun to change. And the observer learns to recognize those first signs. A little more ground cover, a plant recovering where it once struggled, the leaves getting larger, wider, cattle spreading more evenly across a pasture and grazing uniformly, rain soaking into the soil instead of running away. Small things, easy to overlook, but they are often the first sentence of a completely new story. I've learned this many times in cattle breeding. When you select a truly superior bull, the transformation doesn't begin when the grandsons are born. It begins with the very first calf. You may notice better structure, greater fertility, calmer behavior, improved adaptation. The complete result will take years to unfold, but the response has already begun. And the same is true with the land. The first year you stockpile a pasture, you notice standing forage. You save money. That's great. But the second year, perhaps better moisture retention. And several years later, you begin seeing something much deeper. The soil itself has changed. It became spongy. Life has been building capacity one season at a time. And that has taught me a very important distinction. Movement is not the same as direction. And direction is not the same as lasting capacity. Many management decisions produce movement. Some produce lasting change. And the observer learns to tell the difference. That requires patience. Not the patience of waiting without response and without a purpose, but the patience of continuing to observe, to compare, to adjust, to keep asking better questions, because life never finishes responding. Every answer creates the conditions for the next answer. And that may be the most humbling lesson of all. The day I believe I understood nature, I stopped learning from her. So today, I no longer think my responsibility is to have all the answers. My responsibility is to continue improving the quality of my observations, to create better conditions, to recognize new responses, and to remain humble enough to admit that life still has something left to teach me. That is why I often tell my students, study the course, apply it, then come back to it a year later. The information will be the same, but you won't be. You will have made decisions, you will have observed responses, you will have discovered questions that today you cannot even imagine asking. And that is how an observer grows, not by collecting more answers, but by asking better questions. Because every deeper observation changes the observer himself or herself. Looking back now, I realize this observation was never really about weeds or shrubs, or fire, or herbicides, or grazing. Those were simply the stories. The real lesson is much larger. Every one of us is creating conditions through our decisions, our habits, our leadership, our businesses, our families. Every day we leave opportunities behind us. Some create greater life, others slowly reduce it. Whether we recognize them or not, life responds, not to our intentions, not to our promises, not even to our effort alone. Life responds to the conditions we create. And perhaps that is why observation is such a profound responsibility. Because once you begin seeing the conditions, you can no longer pretend they aren't there. You become responsible for the opportunities you create, not only for yourself, but for everyone and everything that will respond to them after you. That is the journey we continue together inside the Total Grazing Academy. Not because we promise perfect answers, but because learning to observe is a lifelong process. Each season reveals something new. Each response teaches a better question, and every better question helps us create better conditions for the future. Because real wealth is never created by controlling life. Real wealth is created by understanding how life responds. And once you truly understand that, you never see a ranch or the world the same way again. This is Jaime Elizondo. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next observation.